Our next topic for review in neuroscience is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is one of the two motor control centers of the CNS, and the other one being the basal ganglia, and it's appropriate to do them kind of back to back because of some similarities in how they're structured and some of the neurotransmitters that they use. First off, the cerebellum is dominated by a cerebellar cortex, and the cortex of the cerebellum has several components to it. One is there's a midline vermal portion to the cerebellum, which you can see here. So that's the vermis, and it has superior and inferior components. Then as we move laterally, we moved into the cerebellar hemisphere, but we have to subdivide that in two parts functionally. Adjacent to the vermis is the paravermal or intermediate hemisphere, and then lateral to that is the bulk of the hemisphere, which constitutes the lateral hemisphere. Finally, spanning both part of a hemisphere and part of the vermis is a flocculonodular lobe that you can see sweeps across and has components in both sections. Functionally, the localization of the cerebellum is important, as is its embryonic origin. The entire cerebellum is derived from a secondary brain vesicle called the metencephalon, which means all of the cerebellar neurons and inputs and outputs are basically associated with a single region of the CNS. As we know, the cerebellum shares an embryonic origin with the pons, metencephalon, but certainly part of the cerebellum overlies the medulla, and the cerebellum is separated from both the pons and the medulla by the fourth ventricle. As we've already indicated, the cerebellar cortex itself consists of a midline vermis and two lateral cerebellar hemispheres. And located cortically in the cerebellum are several maps of all of the skeletal muscles in the body that the cerebellum is associated with controlling. And by controlling, the basic function of the cerebellum is to promote the smooth execution of, or the fine-tuning of, a series of skeletal muscle contractions. So being more specific, we know that the maps located in the vermis are involved in the control of trunk or axial and proximal limb muscles, whereas as we move into the intermediate part of the hemisphere, those cerebellar neurons are involved in the smooth execution of distal limb muscles. And the lateral part of the hemisphere is mainly involved in motor planning, but it's logical to assume that the most motor planning involves the distal limb movements, which are immediately adjacent. Finally, the flocculonodular lobe is more involved in the control of balance and the smooth execution of conjugate gaze associated with eye movements.